The winter twilight came early in Pittsburgh. As snow began to accumulate on the cobblestone streets of the upscale residential area along the Allegheny River, a quiet dinner hour was passing in the Clark mansion. "Elizabeth, would you pass the salt?" Richard Clark said without looking up at his wife, his eyes still fixed on the documents in front of him. Elizabeth silently handed him the salt shaker. They had been married for 5 years and had spent 13 years together, but lately, their conversations consisted only of such mundane exchanges. "How was the hospital today?" Richard finally looked up from his papers. His voice contained more exhaustion than concern. Elizabeth answered with her gaze still lowered to her plate. "The same. No change." Her voice was soft, but the weight of her words spread throughout the dining room. It had been 3 years since they began fertility treatments. Countless tests, injections, medications, and repeated disappointments. Richard let out a slight sigh and returned to his documents. He was a brilliant real estate developer and held a substantial number of shares in Brown Real Estate, which was owned by Elizabeth's parents. As the son-in-law of the Brown family, it was tacitly understood that he would take over the company in the future. Elizabeth's talent as an architectural designer was first-rate, but it was only recognized within businesses related to her parents' company. Brown Real Estate was a prestigious firm spanning 3 generations, and her father, George Brown, was a businessman known for his iron will. "You haven't forgotten about tomorrow's dinner, have you?" Elizabeth tried to change the subject. "Your parents and sister are coming, right?" Richard looked up. "Victoria said she has some news to share." Elizabeth frowned slightly. Her sister Victoria was the daughter who received all their parents' love. Beautiful and sociable, she was always the center of attention. In contrast, Elizabeth was reserved and quiet by nature. The sisters were so different that it surprised everyone around them. "I see. She's probably accomplished something wonderful again," Elizabeth said sarcastically. "Last month she was boasting about setting record sales figures for Dad's company's big project." "Victoria really is talented," Richard said with genuine admiration. "Becoming the head of the sales department at her age is no small feat." Elizabeth continued eating in silence. She understood the hidden meaning behind Richard's words. Victoria was the perfect daughter. She had a career, beauty, and above all, a body that could bear children. The phone rang, and Richard got up from his seat. Elizabeth could hear him speaking in a low voice in the kitchen. She gazed at the snowy landscape outside the window, wondering how her life had come to this. When she met Richard in college, he was the most brilliant student in the architecture department. They shared the same dreams and passions. After graduation, they had planned to start a small design firm together. However, George spotted Richard's talent and brought him into Brown Real Estate. Gradually, Richard's dreams were replaced by the future Elizabeth's parents had envisioned for him. Elizabeth had objected, but eventually compromised and decided to become involved in the family business herself. "I promise to play golf with Victoria next week," Richard said when he returned. "She wants to discuss some new clients in New York." Elizabeth didn't look up from her plate. "I see. Why don't you come along?" Richard suggested, but his words lacked sincerity. "Thank you, but I have a fertility treatment scheduled," Elizabeth replied flatly. Richard fell silent. Elizabeth could see disappointment on his face. They had once dreamed of having children together. Now, that dream had created a deep divide between them. "Have your parents said anything?" Richard carefully chose his words. Elizabeth gave a bitter smile. "Oh, of course. Mother said last week that I should change fertility specialists." "And father?" She paused. "Father said the Clark name must continue." Richard said nothing. His silence spoke volumes. The next morning, when Elizabeth woke up, Richard had already left. A brief note was placed on the kitchen table. "Can't get home early today. Have a meeting with Victoria. Don't wait up for dinner." Elizabeth carefully folded the note and threw it in the trash. Snow continued to fall outside the window. She took out her cell phone and called her doctor. Dr. Schmidt, good morning. This is Elizabeth Clark. If you have time this afternoon for a consultation. Yes, thank you. She hung up and took a deep breath. Today, she planned to discuss the results of her last fertility treatment. And if the results remained unchanged, she would have to make a major decision. On her way home from the hospital, Elizabeth's steps were heavy. The conversation with Dr. Schmidt kept replaying in her mind. I'm sorry, Mrs. Clark. The last treatment was also ineffective. She parked her car in front of her house and rested her forehead on the steering wheel for a while. No tears came. It felt as if she had run out of tears. As she headed toward the entrance, she noticed an unfamiliar luxury car parked there. Her parents must be visiting. Elizabeth took a deep breath and opened the door. I'm home, Elizabeth announced quietly. There was no response from the living room. She took off her shoes and hung up her coat. As she walked down the hallway, she saw her parents, Richard, and Victoria gathered in the living room, a tense atmosphere hanging in the air. Hello, Elizabeth tried to smile, but lost her words at their somber expressions. Father George was sitting on a heavy sofa, both hands resting on his cane. Mother Martha was seated next to him, sitting up straight with her legs elegantly crossed. Richard stood by the window, appearing to look at the scenery outside, but his posture was filled with tension. And Victoria was sitting in Elizabeth's usual chair, with perfect makeup and hairstyle, staring at her sister. Elizabeth, sit down, George's voice was low and filled with authority. He didn't look at his daughter and began speaking as if in an important business meeting. Elizabeth silently followed her father's instructions and sat down at the edge of the sofa, the only remaining seat. What did the doctor say? Martha asked. Her voice seemed gentle, but her eyes were cold. No change today, Elizabeth answered quietly. The last treatment was ineffective. A heavy silence dominated the living room. George sighed and finally spoke. Richard, it's time to make a decision. Elizabeth is defective. There is no future staying with a woman who cannot bear children. Divorce her and marry Victoria. Elizabeth couldn't believe her ears. Defective? She was shocked by her father's words, feeling as if she couldn't breathe. Father. She tried to raise her voice, but only a hoarse sound came out. Be quiet, Elizabeth, Martha said sternly. This is for the family. Brown real estate has been passed down through blood-related heirs for generations. Richard needs an heir. Elizabeth couldn't believe her ears. But... Sister, Victoria interjected. Her voice was sweet, but her eyes gleamed triumphantly. You're over 30 now, why don't you give up? Leave it to me. Richard and I have gotten along since our college days. Elizabeth gripped her knees with trembling hands. Victoria, what are you saying? He's my husband. A wife who cannot produce blood-related offspring is not a true wife, George coldly declared. Richard's talent cannot be wasted. He has the obligation to continue the company. Elizabeth desperately looked at Richard. She prayed that he would say something, that he would protect her. Richard. She called her husband's name. Richard finally turned his gaze from the window and faced Elizabeth. His face was unreadable. Elizabeth, he called her name and hesitated for a moment. We've tried enough. For 5 years, we've tried to have a child. It's at its limit. Elizabeth's heart froze. Richard, even you. I'm sorry, it's not possible with you. Richard looked down at Elizabeth with cold eyes. Considering the company and children. I need an heir. Elizabeth's world collapsed. She stood up and looked around the room. Her parents, sister, and husband. The people she thought were her family now seemed like strangers. Are you all really okay with this? Elizabeth's voice trembled. Is blood relation all that makes a family? Elizabeth, look at reality, Martha said calmly. Business isn't driven by emotions. This is for the good of the entire family. Family? Elizabeth gave a bitter laugh. This is family? Abandoning each other, betraying each other, living only for bloodlines, this is family? Don't get emotional, George said sternly. Victoria and Richard are a perfect match. The company will be secure. Elizabeth silently left the room. She went upstairs, entered the bedroom, and quickly took out a suitcase. While packing the minimum necessary clothing and personal items, her mind was in chaos. When she finished packing, the door opened, and Richard was standing there. His face showed signs of guilt, but determination was also visible. I'll pay you ample alimony, he said quietly. The house, the car, whatever you need. Elizabeth looked at him. The man she once loved, the man with whom she once dreamed. Now he was a stranger. I don't want anything, she said quietly. Just send me the divorce papers. Elizabeth picked up her suitcase and passed by Richard. When she went downstairs, her parents and Victoria were still sitting in the living room. They looked at her, but no one said anything. Elizabeth headed for the entrance and left the house without looking back. The snow had begun to fall heavily. She loaded her suitcase into the car and started the engine. Taking one last look at the house reflected in the rearview mirror, Elizabeth made up her mind. Leave Pittsburgh and start a new life. The West Coast, Seattle. She had never been there, but now it seemed like a symbol of a new beginning. Elizabeth drove off into the snow. Tears fell from her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness, they were tears of liberation. The rain in Seattle was gentle. It didn't have the coldness of Pittsburgh's snow, but a warmth that washed and cleansed the earth. Elizabeth was gazing at the rain-soaked city from the window of her small apartment. 3 months had passed since she moved. The room had only minimal furniture, but the walls were decorated with architectural sketches Elizabeth had drawn. She took a deep breath and looked at the clock. It was time to head to her new workplace. Robinson Architects was a highly regarded architectural firm in Seattle. Elizabeth had applied for a job she found on the internet and sent in her portfolio. When she visited Seattle for the interview, she was captivated by the city's open atmosphere. Good morning, Ms. Clark, the receptionist, Kate, greeted her cheerfully. Elizabeth smiled back. No one here knew about her past. She was simply a talented architectural designer. Not an infertile wife, not defective. Michael is waiting for you. He wants to talk about a new project. Elizabeth nodded and headed to the president's office. Michael Robinson had lost his wife to illness 10 years ago. He was raising his 10-year-old adopted daughter, Samantha, alone while running the company. Elizabeth, thank you for coming, Michael opened the door and welcomed her. His smile was genuine. Please sit down. Elizabeth sat down and listened to Michael's explanation of the new project. It was the design of an elementary school using sustainable materials. I want you to be the lead designer for this project, Michael said with a serious expression. I was impressed by your talent for environmentally conscious design in your portfolio. Elizabeth was surprised. But I've only been here for 3 months. Talent doesn't have a probationary period, Michael smiled. Besides, Samantha likes you. Her opinion is important to me. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile. She had met Samantha at the company's family day last week. She was an intelligent and curious girl. Thank you. I'll do my best. That evening, as Elizabeth was about to leave the office, she heard a small voice. Elizabeth. She turned around to see Samantha standing there with her school backpack. Michael was right behind her. I'll tell you what I learned at school today, Samantha said excitedly. And I want to see the buildings you designed too. Elizabeth looked at Michael. He shrugged with a troubled expression. Sorry, Samantha wants to talk with you. If you don't mind, how about dinner for the 3 of us? Elizabeth hesitated. But looking at Samantha's expectant eyes, she couldn't find a reason to refuse. I'd be delighted. They had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Seattle. Samantha vividly talked about what happened at school, and Elizabeth answered her questions. Michael watched their interaction with warm eyes. "Did you know me before I was born?" Samantha suddenly asked. Michael gently stroked his daughter's hair. "No, Samantha. We met when you were 5. Do you remember?" Elizabeth couldn't hide her surprised expression. "I'm adopted," Samantha said proudly. "Dad chose me." Michael smiled. "More accurately, we chose each other." On the way home, after Samantha had fallen asleep, Michael explained to Elizabeth. After his wife passed away, he suffered from loneliness. Through a friend's introduction, he participated in a foster parent program and met Samantha. Her parents had died in a traffic accident. "Blood ties don't matter," Michael said quietly. "If there's love, that's family." Elizabeth felt her heart tighten. Her family had only thought about bloodlines and property. From then on, the time Elizabeth spent with Michael and Samantha increased. On weekends, they would go to the park, watch movies, or sometimes cook together. Elizabeth helped Samantha with her homework, and Michael gave opinions on her designs. After half a year had passed, Michael invited her to dinner at his home. After Samantha went to bed, he gathered his courage and confessed his feelings. "Elizabeth, I like you. But I don't want to rush you. You must have a past, and I have responsibilities. I just wanted you to know." Elizabeth was touched by his sincerity. For the first time, she talked about her past, her marriage to Richard, her infertility issues, and the rejection from her family. It was painful to put into words, but at the same time, it was liberating. Michael listened silently and finally took her hand. "You are not defective. You're a wonderful woman. Blood ties don't make a family. Love makes a family." At those words, Elizabeth couldn't stop her tears. A year later, Elizabeth and Michael got married. Friends of Michael's and new colleagues Elizabeth had met gathered at the small church for the ceremony. Samantha wore a wedding dress and walked down the aisle scattering flowers. "I have the best dad, and from today, the best mom," Samantha proudly declared before the guests. The guests responded with warm smiles and applause. Elizabeth understood the true meaning of family for the first time in her life. Not blood ties, property, or social status. Respecting each other, supporting each other, and loving unconditionally is what creates a family. 3 months after the wedding, Elizabeth noticed changes in her health. Morning sickness, unusual fatigue. She nervously went for a medical examination. "Congratulations, Mrs. Clark. You're pregnant," the doctor announced with a smile. Elizabeth gasped. "But I am. I was told I was infertile." Sometimes when couples adopt a child, they are released from psychological pressure and conceive naturally, the doctor explained kindly. "In your case, stress was probably a major obstacle." Returning home, Elizabeth told Michael and Samantha. Michael embraced her, and Samantha jumped around excitedly. "I'm getting a brother or sister." "Really?" Samantha's eyes sparkled. "Yes, really," Elizabeth answered, and the 3 of them hugged. During a checkup 5 months later, Elizabeth learned she was expecting twins. She lay in bed, placing her hand on her stomach. "You are very loved," she spoke softly. "It doesn't matter whether there are blood ties or not. We are family." Outside the window, Seattle's gentle rain continued to fall. Elizabeth closed her eyes and smiled at the ironic turn her life had taken. The moment she thought she had lost everything was actually the beginning of finding what truly mattered. "Sophia, Harper, make sure you hold hands," Elizabeth called out to her twin daughters while holding a shopping basket. The 2-year-old twins, with golden curls and bright eyes, were wearing identical light blue dresses. "Mommy, I want that." Sophia pointed to the candy aisle. "No." After lunch, Elizabeth answered in a gentle but firm voice. The large shopping mall in the Seattle suburbs was bustling with weekend shoppers. Michael and Samantha approached from behind Elizabeth. Samantha had become a responsible older sister. "Mom, can I buy this book?" Samantha asked, showing a science book. "Of course, Samantha," Elizabeth smiled. It will help with your college preparation. College is still far away, Michael laughed. He took the shopping basket from Elizabeth and picked up one of the twins with his other hand. Well, Michael, Elizabeth grinned. The day these girls go to college will come before you know it. They finished buying groceries and decided to have a light lunch at the food court. While Samantha was looking after the twins, Elizabeth and Michael went to get drinks. Elizabeth leaned happily against Michael's arm. I can't believe it, she said softly. 3 years ago, I couldn't have imagined such happiness awaiting me. Michael kissed her cheek. You deserve this happiness. It was then that a familiar silhouette entered the edge of Elizabeth's vision. She stopped and caught her breath. On the opposite side of the food court stood Richard, Victoria, and her parents, George and Martha. Elizabeth? Michael asked, noticing the change in her expression. What's wrong? Elizabeth was speechless. Their appearance, which she was seeing for the first time in 3 years, was quite different from what she remembered. Richard's hair had thinned, and his face showed deep signs of fatigue. Victoria had lost her former radiance and was looking around with a nervous expression. Her parents also seemed aged, especially her father George, who appeared to rely more heavily on his cane. That's my former family, Elizabeth finally managed to say. Michael looked in their direction and squeezed Elizabeth's hand. Are you okay? Do you want to go over there? Or would you rather avoid them? Elizabeth took a deep breath. There was no need to run away, she told herself. No, it's fine. Let's go back to our table. As they were eating, the inevitable moment arrived. Richard came to get drinks and caught Elizabeth's eye. He stopped in his tracks, surprised. Elizabeth. She nodded calmly. Richard. Richard looked at Elizabeth's table. Samantha and the twin daughters, and Michael. Complex emotions crossed his face. Family, he asked quietly. Yes, my family, Elizabeth answered proudly. Richard seemed about to say something, but just then Victoria approached. She froze for a moment when she saw Elizabeth. Elizabeth? Her voice was mixed with surprise. Is it really you? Hello, Victoria, Elizabeth responded flatly. Her parents must have noticed too, as they slowly approached. Michael stood up and introduced himself. I'm Michael Robinson. Elizabeth's husband. After a heavy silence, Elizabeth asked, What brings you to Seattle? Business, George answered. His voice wasn't as powerful as before. A branch office on the West Coast. He cut off his words. How are you doing? As you can see, very happy, Elizabeth replied. The twins looked at her and smiled. Children. Martha said with surprise. Yours. Yes, my children. Sophia and Harper, they're 2 years old, Elizabeth said proudly. But you were. Victoria began, quickly swallowing her words. Elizabeth smiled gently. Infertile? Yes, I was. But sometimes medical miracles happen. Won't you sit down? Michael suggested. Let's talk a bit. They sat at the adjacent table. Samantha was looking at them with curious eyes, but when she noticed Elizabeth's glance, she devoted herself to keeping the twins entertained. You look well, Elizabeth said. However, happiness or satisfaction did not come through in their expressions. Business is going through difficult times, George said in a tired voice. The real estate market is changing rapidly. Your company? Richard asked Elizabeth. Robinson Architects. Michael is the president, and I'm the chief designer, she answered. We've gained a reputation for environmentally friendly architecture. I'm glad your talent is being recognized, Martha smiled faintly. After a silence, Victoria suddenly spoke up. We can't have children. Elizabeth stared at her in surprise. Ironic, isn't it? Victoria gave a bitter smile. I too have become a defective. Richard frowned uncomfortably and looked away. Elizabeth was at a loss for words. Have you considered adoption? She asked quietly. George objected, Richard answered shortly. Without blood ties. Blood ties aren't everything, Elizabeth looked toward Samantha. She's Michael's adopted daughter. She's our family. Congratulations, George said, but his voice was mixed with envy. You were stronger than we thought. Elizabeth held Michael's hand and smiled. Strength can't be found alone. It's found because you have people who support each other, a true family. The company? Richard abruptly asked. Brown Real Estate is not doing well. I heard, Elizabeth answered. It's been talked about in Seattle's real estate circles too. Won't you help us? George suddenly said. With the power of your new company. Elizabeth took a deep breath. There was no anger left in her heart. She only felt sorry for them and had the conviction that her choices had been right. There are things I can do, she said slowly. But there are conditions. They looked at her with expectation. Understanding that blood ties and profit alone don't make a family. And rebuilding a family in the true sense. Elizabeth said nothing more and stood up to return to the table where her family was. Michael put his arm around her shoulder and Samantha waved. The twins smiled happily seeing their mom. She looked back just once over her shoulder. Her former family was staring at her in bewilderment. This wasn't a reunion for revenge or to show off. Elizabeth had chosen to live her happiness. And that was the greatest victory. Welcome to the Robinson Family Initiative, Elizabeth gripped the microphone and looked out at the gathered people. The new multipurpose hall in downtown Seattle was filled with families considering adoption and supporters. In the 5 years since the reunion at the shopping mall, her life had changed even more. We are a family bound by love, not blood ties, she continued. And we want to share that experience with many of you. Michael stood on the stage and came to her side. His eyes held a light of pride. The Robinson Family Initiative supports families considering adoption and also works to improve the foster care system, Michael added. We believe all children have the right to be loved. The NPO that Elizabeth and Michael had established had grown rapidly over the past 3 years. Their activities were featured in the media and touched the hearts of many people. After the lecture, Elizabeth was talking with a woman in the corner of the venue. It was Victoria. Sister. Elizabeth, Victoria corrected herself. Her expression no longer held the arrogance of the past. You were right. Richard and I got divorced. Elizabeth nodded quietly. Victoria and Richard's marriage had ended 2 years ago. She had heard that Richard eventually started throwing the word defective at Victoria too. The company? Elizabeth asked. Bankrupt, Victoria said flatly. Father had a heart attack, and mother is working part-time. Pride, property, everything is lost. Elizabeth held her sister's hand. But you can start anew. Victoria looked at Elizabeth with tearful eyes. Can you forgive me? I said terrible things back then. The past is the past, Elizabeth said kindly. What matters is what you choose now. Could I work at your NPO? Victoria asked shyly. If there's something I can do. Elizabeth smiled. Of course. Can you come tomorrow? On the opposite side of the hall, Samantha was playing with the twins, who were now 7 years old. 18-year-old Samantha was preparing for college, planning to study child psychology. Michael returned to Elizabeth. Your parents? They're coming to our house tomorrow, Elizabeth answered. It's their first time meeting us, but I want them to understand what I value. Michael embraced her. You're a wonderful person. Elizabeth looked back. Various forms of families had gathered in the venue. There were families connected by blood, families who had welcomed adopted children, and foster families. Her heart was filled with warmth. On the way home, Elizabeth gazed at the scenery outside the car window. Seattle's rain continued to fall gently, blurring the city lights. Come to think of it, that day, I left home after being called a defective, she said quietly. But that was the turning point in my life. Michael held her hand. Sometimes, the greatest setback can become the greatest gift. Elizabeth nodded and looked at the children sleeping in the back seat. Samantha, Sophia, Harper. And in her womb, a new life was growing. According to the doctor, it was going to be a boy. What makes a true family? Elizabeth smiled. It's not blood ties, but recognizing each other, supporting each other, and loving unconditionally. The car continued through the rain, and they returned to their home where the warm lights of the Robinson family were glowing.